If this place doesn't bring you to your knees crying, you're not working hard enough. We are farmers of the sea. We grow Pacific oysters, blue mussels, and 7 varieties of kelp.
We grew up in the same town. It's called Little Compton, Rhode Island. We always had so much fun harvesting the ocean. We just go fishing every day. I just thought like, oh, we can do anything together. Both of us, our whole lives, have wanted to come to Alaska. I feel like ever since we were kids, we just always had our eyes set on this place. We just wanted a new challenge, a new adventure.
You can only get here by boat, and there's only 15 people that live here in the winter.
Halibut Cove sucks you in. Back on the East Coast, yeah, there's usually someone watching, and like out here in Alaska, a lot of times we're working alone and in the dark. It's a lot more risky. We had some really hard days.
All of your hopes and dreams just tangled. We've had emergency room visits, and it's rough and 10 degrees.
Predatory bear attacks.
Gotta keep trying. Failing scares me the most. Just not knowing what tomorrow's gonna bring. You could die. I could die. It's so real. It's so raw.
Greg's a problem solver. He just never gives up and always works so hard for everyone around him. Greg and I really try to work together as a team. We have each other's back.
I just love farming. I love seeing the oysters and seeing them grow and like seeing the mussels grow and the kelp grow and like provide for them. It's kind of addicting and you don't want to stop.
I love the ocean so much and I want to see it thrive in the future, and I really want to see it protected and us use it responsibly.
She's definitely a visionary. She saw us and what we could make together, and she's like, we're gonna start a family and we're gonna have a business. My family gets me up in the morning. My family is my purpose. The one thing I want to pass on to my children is work ethic. Our family's passionate about the wilderness and getting out and exploring. Every corner we come around, we just want to keep going around the next corner and we don't want to stop. And like being able to experience it and being able to be here and being able to be part of it, it's rare. Wilderness is rare. I'm not sure what they're going to think of their experiences. It's been quite a road. I mean, they see us do all sorts of things and we do it all together, and I really think it's going to be a positive experience for them, and just really think it's going to give them a leg up.
I believe deeply in our mission here in Halibut Cove. I feel like we're so lucky to be able to experience what we do.
So proud to feed people. It's probably one of the best parts of the business is actually to feed people sustainably and organically. It's really challenging what we do. We're the one person out there doing it. There's lots of obstacles to overcome. I want people to do what we're doing. I want people to go out and experience it and try it, because we did it. We proved it.
You learn to survive and even thrive here. You have confidence in this life.
I was born to be a farmer, and I will farm until the day I die.
I'm Weatherly.
I'm Greg.
We're extra tough. So we're Alaska Shellfish Farms. We're located in Halibut Cove, Kachemak Bay. And I should have put up a map of Alaska as well, just to show where we are, but it's it's called South Central Alaska. It's about 5 hours south of Anchorage, a drive 5 hours south, about 200 mile, or how far is it? 200 miles. Hold on. It's not letting me for some reason.
If you click back over to PowerPoint and just click on the slide, it should let you switch.
Wait, hold on. Okay. Our farm operates in the traditional homeland of the Dena'ina people. This is our friend Coral. She's Native Alaskan, and we work a lot with her. We like to acknowledge that our farms on these lands and the people cared for these lands for thousands of years, and we're committed to doing the same. There's a lot of sign of people that have lived in Kachemak Bay for thousands of years. Middens, which are ancient garbage pits. They're full of like clam shells and mussel shells, which shows the importance that seafood has had, and shellfish specifically, to people in this area. As Greg mentioned before, we came to Halibut Cove. There was already oyster farms established, which it's always hard when there's a new type of thing going on, and that challenge had already been removed because the farms were in place. It takes a lot of like working with community to make a shellfish farm happen. We depend on a lot on our elders of our community for knowledge. Local knowledge is important to us. Being farmers, you really have to be connected to your land and your community.
Traditional food source for Rhode Island is shellfish. They were digging clams and oysters for thousands of years, and shellfish have been an important food source for thousands of years for Native Americans and early settlers.
Yeah, as you guys probably eat shellfish in Rhode Island, there's, Rhode Island and quahogs are pretty symbolic. But at the same time, shellfish have been depleted everywhere. Growing up in Rhode Island or Little Compton, both of us would fish, and my father was a fisherman, and seeing the decline in fisheries that had happened in his lifetime and witnessing it in ours, different species, declining, especially shellfish, made us really want to start growing shellfish together. Farming shellfish kind of helps like the cultural legacy live on, because people love to eat shellfish. It's a really healthy food. It has a lot of protein, and they call it like a brain food.
And it's the bottom of the food chain. So it's it doesn't take much to grow it. It's really good protein. Mussels are loaded with omega-3s. Our background, we went to the University of Rhode Island for fisheries and aquaculture. And then in 2003, we moved to Maine and started managing an oyster farm there. And it wasn't just quite an adventure. So we moved to Alaska in 2007 because we saw opportunity up here. And with the fisheries declining, we knew that aquaculture was the way to the path forward. We worked on various farms in Kachemak Bay until we got our own farm in 2010. And that's when we started our own operation. And we've kind of acquired quite a few of the operations in Halibut Cove.
Yeah, there's a $10 billion seafood trade deficit the US has. So a lot of seafood that we consume has been grown in other countries or is caught in other countries. And So there's a big push for the United States to scale up its aquaculture production. Worldwide, aquaculture now accounts for about 53% of all the seafood consumed. And the US has been pretty slow to develop its farms because we had for a while robust fisheries when settlers came over to the Americas. Most of these fisheries had never been really commercially fished, but now in today's time, we're seeing the impacts that commercial fishing has had on the oceans, and there's becoming more farms are becoming more important to coastal communities.
And shrimp is the biggest seafood in the US, and most of it's imported and farm raised, and it's not very sustainable. So if we can replace like the option for shrimp with an oyster on people's appetizer plates, that's like a win for us. If people choose our oysters over the shrimp because it supports our little family and it's sustainable and organic.
Yeah.
And grown in the US.
There's a lot of benefits to oyster aquaculture. Shellfish play a really critical role in coastal marine habitats. They can improve water quality. There's a lot of excess nutrients that unfortunately run off the land from people fertilizing and different agricultural runoff. That creates algae, and these algae can like choke the water of nutrients, but shellfish can help filter some of that algae out and keep the water clear and oxygenated, which helps the fish and other creatures survive. So the benefits of aquaculture, you're putting some substrate in the water, and if you've ever noticed, like reefs and anything that like that's structure that different juvenile fish and invertebrates live in, and oysters, even farmed oysters, act as habitat. They act just like a natural oyster reef and can promote tons of life, because oysters are some of the most diverse marine life or in the oceans. So it's really good to have oysters in place. Unfortunately, oysters were depleted and have been impacted by disease on the East Coast and the West Coast. And so oyster farming is becoming more and more important to restoring the natural ecosystem. If you've heard of the Billion Oyster Project in New York, they're trying to reestablish at least 1 billion oysters in New York Harbor, because those oysters protect the oceans they can buffer against tide surge or storm surge, and also provide habitat, and they're hoping to restore some of the harbor using oysters.
And they're even using that model. They're beginning to think about using that model up here, like restoring the fisheries with just filling some of the bays with oyster farms, because they are so rich. If you take 1 acre of our oyster farm and calculate all the biomass that's there besides oysters, it's tons and tons of little shrimp and fish and all sorts of the juvenile species that are like commercially viable, and it provides all the habitat for them. And they're thinking about Alaska and all the coastline here, and the farms would really the coastline would really benefit, and even the commercially viable species would boom because we're providing the habitat for the juveniles.
Yeah. So unfortunately, our oceans are at risk from climate or impacts of burning fossil fuels. The warming of the oceans and ocean acidification is already starting to impact us. Oysters are kind of like the canaries in the coal mine, because they're shell building organisms. They rely on a like non-acidic water, because they extract calcium carbonate from the water to produce their shell. And if there's too much acidity, they're not able to do that. We just saw the Bering Sea crab collapse. The population of king crabs is like no longer, and they think that's because of ocean acidification and warming of the waters.
Yeah, when we first moved to Alaska, we thought it would be booming fisheries and this, the docks would just be full of boats and toting up fish and seafood, but it's really not the case. It's been dying out since the 70s and 80s. There was major crab crashes back then, and it still hasn't recovered in a lot of areas, including ours. Kachemak Bay has about as much coastline as the whole state of Rhode Island, and there isn't very many commercial fisheries here in Kachemak Bay.
Yeah, worldwide, fish populations have crashed by 50% in the last 4 decades. So it's going to be more and more critical to, eat fish that are farm raised or shellfish, and can, help stabilize the decline in wild fish populations.
Our farm has grown to 23 acres. We harvest Pacific oysters year round and ship them all over, blue mussels, and 7 varieties of kelp. Here we are with our boat. It's actually an East Coast lobster boat that we have out here, and we're harvesting kelp. You can see the lines are just full of kelp. There's oyster cages in there, but that is all natural kelp there that we've been harvesting, and Weatherly dries it and sells it in the spring. And like I said, that's all just natural. It all just happens there from the tides bringing it in, and it's setting on there.
Yeah, so kelp and oysters, they sequester carbon, oysters do in their shells, and kelp absorbs carbon dioxide from the water, and it grows from that. So it is really, they're both really good for the planet. As Greg mentioned, they're at the bottom of the food chain. Our oysters eat algae. We don't have to feed them, and we don't have to fertilize them. So there's no fresh water inputs needed. You don't have to feed them. So it's like really a sustainable protein source. It's ranked shellfish, farm shellfish, the most sustainable protein source that you can consume.
We have an ecosystem-based approach to the ecosystem-based approach building block. Ecosystem-based,
It's the implementation of agricultural practices that take advantage of biodiversity, ecosystem services, or the ecological process. So ecosystem services are all those critters that Greg was mentioning that live in our oyster farm. Over here on this side, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there are green sea urchins. This is called the chitin. We have blue mussels all right here. All of these animals just live and grow in with our oysters. The urchins actually eat the algae on the outside of the oyster shells, so it keeps them cleaner, as does this little creature. And at the end of the day, this food source basically goes back into the water off of our boat and feeds the larger mammals like sea otters. Our farm, in any given day, you can go out and see a dozen to up to like 60 otters in the fall. They eat mussels that are growing on our lines and our buoys. So having all that structure there provides lots of habitat and food for different animals. All the kelp that grows on our farm just naturally grows because anything you basically put in the ocean is habitat. In other countries, they use, they're called fish aggregating devices, and it's just basically a raft. If you put a raft in the ocean with palm fronds hanging below it, fish will attract to that and start living there, and then you get bigger fish and that people can eat. So anyway, habitat, it's basically we grow animals that want to grow there. We just give them the substrate.
And everything is, our farm is supporting everything, all different kinds of creatures. You can see the urchins there and the little mussels and the chitin up to the sea otters, and even the orcas, the killer whales, come and eat the sea otters. So it's from the top predator down to the bottom. Filter feeders are supported on our farm. Here's a picture of our farm. We have mussels growing on the rafts, and then we have the long lines in the background where the oysters are growing.
Yeah, these long lines are buoys with a line, and then the oysters just hang down below the surface in cages. Here's an oyster cage, and this talks a little bit about what we're doing. It's considered deep water long line and raft culture with suspended cages. Suspended means the cages are in the water column, floating below the surface, so they're always in the water. There's other types of aquaculture that are intertidal. That's another way you can grow oysters, is having them in an area where the tide goes, it's low enough that they're exposed to water at low, or exposed to air at low tide. Oysters like estuaries, those are areas where freshwater and saltwater mix. Kachemak Bay is a large estuary. Estuaries in Rhode Island are places like Fogland, Briggs Marsh, down at Quicksand Pond. Estuaries are really important nurseries for juvenile fish, and that's why shellfish are so important, because they live in estuaries and help create some of that prime habitat that is totally critical to most marine creatures. I mean, about 80% of a lot of marine creatures need an estuary to develop. So they need that fresh water. A lot of species of crustaceans, fish.
Our 23 acres were permitted for 50 400-foot long lines and 30 40 by 40 rafts, where we can fit 90,000 of the trays. That's a stack of trays, the picture there. So there's a tray there. We can fit 90,000 trays on our 23 acres.
Yeah, so our farm is pretty deep water. Where we are in Halibut Cove is kind of like fjords. Our farm's between 60 and 180 feet deep. So the oysters only hang in the top column of the water, but it's really deep there.
And we're about a third of the way developed. So we have about 30,000 trays. The farm elements, the farmer, very crucial. It takes a generational knowledge to build these farms. On the West Coast, a lot of the farms have been going for over 100 years in Washington State. Washington State is the biggest producer in the country, and a lot of the farms have been going for 5 generations, so over 100 years. And then the operations, how you run your farm, and then the water is a public resource, so you need community support.
This is just a quick video. We wanted to talk a little bit about how the ecosystem-based approach, we try to take advantage of what grows on our farm. Here in Alaska, oysters aren't native. The Pacific oysters are native to Japan, but they've been being farmed on the Pacific coast for well over 150 years. And on the East Coast, we have the eastern oyster. In Little Compton, eastern oysters are native. So all of the farmed oysters on the East Coast are the native eastern oyster.
And again, that's all natural set kelp. So that's all just naturally set there. And there's oyster cages under there. And in the oyster cages, there's hundreds of fish and shrimp and urchins and mussels. So you can just see how, like, you know, when we put the oyster cages out there, it was a sterile line, just clean new gear. And then it turns into that in just 6 months.
Yeah. So kelp has been on the radar lately. I think it made the New York Times this week. Kelp is really healthy and good to eat, but as Americans, we don't all have it on our diets. And if you had a chance to try it, or if anyone eats kelp and likes it, it is healthy for the planet and it's healthy for you.
Here's our mussels. They are naturally set. So we just set out ropes on top of the water column, and the mussels naturally set to them. You can see we roam on the rafts. When you have predators, like in Maine, they have to grow that. These rafts are actually from Maine. And when you have predators, you have to surround your raft in a predator net. And that's why we do the rafts. And you grow them on the ropes, just like how you would see Prince Edward Island rope grown mussels. It's the same principles and technology and everything else. And you can see I'm holding a mussel line there, and it would hang 25 feet below the raft. And all the way to the right is a mussel line coming on board for processing.
Yeah. So these mussels, as Greg was saying, we just harvest or collect them on ropes on the surface. So every year in the summer, mussels and oysters, they just broadcast their eggs. And so those eggs have to find a place to settle after they're fertilized. And that's something like the ropes we put in place. But that happens in Little Compton as well. Every spring, there's like billions of mussels in the water, and you could potentially go out and collect those and grow them on the ropes. It's done a lot in Maine and Prince Edward Island, and I think there have been some trial mussel farms off of Newport. So here is a little video of the kelp. We're talking about when we say ecosystem services, it is the benefit of all the other creatures, the filtering of the water, the creating of oxygen from kelp that's growing. They all provide kelp. They call it the halo effect, and it can help buffer the water against ocean acidification because it extracts CO2 from the water, and that can help keep the pH from dropping too low and keep it stabilized. And that in turn helps the oysters' shell growth because they need to get the calcium carbonate from the water, and the kelp helps that process stay intact.
On the right-hand side is a tiger rockfish, and it was from the oyster cage. Like we were saying before, they can live to up to 120 years. And they're just a really cool species. And every time we release one, we think of our commitment to keeping the oceans going for the next 100 years. What's it going to look like in 100 years?
Here's some oyster processing. Oysters, they are quite a bit of work, especially the processing of them. It takes about 3 to 4 years to grow them. So the farming is probably the most work. You have to tend them, you have to shape them. They don't want to just grow into a perfect oyster. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into the oyster growing. And when we market them, we have to count them all and put them in boxes and deliver them to local restaurants and ship them. So we just built this oyster barge. We got a used hovercraft from the North Slope, Prudhoe Bay, which is, if you've ever heard of Alaska's oil, this boat was used up there, and we converted it into an oyster barge. So we like to think of that as a good sign for our future, like converting away from fossil fuels and into regenerative farming. Here's our kelp processing. It's pretty simple. We dry the kelp on clotheslines with clothespins in the springtime. It takes about 24 hours. The kelp is wet and heavy, but after we dried it, it's about 1/10 of the weight. So we can ship it, and it's shelf stable for actually decades. They keep it for in Japan. So that's just how we do our kelp.
Here's a picture of our farm stand anchored out at the farm, and Halibut, Cove, and Homer has a large tourist industry, and the farm stand's really caught on with what we call them water taxis. It's all stand, all the tourists and people like to come and they actually walk to the glacier, and they can stop at the farm stand and get oysters, and it's really cool because like it's supporting other businesses. All the lodges like to get oysters, and it's all of our friends who own the lodges and own the water taxis. So in the charter businesses, there's less and less halibut and less charter fishing, and so the charter boats, there's 1,000 charter boats in Homer, and they're not allowed to fish on Wednesdays, and they have more and more restrictions. So it gives them something to do. They can take their boats and come over to the farm and with clients and come get oysters and have a picnic, and they talk about the farming, and they just kind of cruise around the farm real slow and eat their oysters and just wave and stuff. We just kind of say hi briefly. We usually have machines going, the oyster tumbler and stuff, so we can't like sit there and talk, but we tell the water taxis and the lodges what to say, and they relay the messages to the customers, and it's a real hit. And it's really nice that it's like supports other businesses.
And supports people's eating seafood, because a lot of times people, they go out fishing and they might not unfortunately catch something, and they can come to the farm stand and they still are able to get healthy protein. And it's basically, it's just eating from the wild. So this seafood that we're growing is kind of like the same as a wild fish, how they've been eating just the natural food its whole life.
And the farm stand has really built community trust, because it's just like a sinking skiff out there with a cooler on it, and people come and they get the oysters, and they're just like, what? And they can just leave the money in there, and there's already money there, so they're just like, this is so cool. And it's like, builds the trust. We trust them, they trust us. And
we were awarded Alaska's Farm Family of the Year in 2020. We just kind of shows in Alaska, food security is very important. We're geographically isolated and dependent on importing food, and Alaska tries to, advance its food security. The healthier the food is to where you are, the closer the food is to where you live, the healthier it is for you. So supporting your local farmers is really important, and it's also good for you.
And the state's really starting to acknowledge that, the fisheries are kind of in dire straits, and mariculture is an option. And so they're really trying to promote the mariculture up here. It's really nice to be here and having the state that's like, oh yeah, this is what we want to see.
And need to see it too, because they don't want to see the coastal culture die out. Like fish and eating fish and shellfish is really important to people, and they really want to keep that legacy.
Every coastal community in Alaska is losing population because there aren't enough fisheries to keep up with it, and people are moving out. And they're looking at mariculture, where people can make a livelihood and move back to the coastal communities.
And by doing mariculture, it creates all the ecosystems. So it'll help bolster fisheries at the same time as creating mariculture jobs. So our goal is to grow 5 million market oysters, 400,000 pounds of mussels, and we already have about 300,000 pounds of kelp. It's just kind of a developing market in the US.
And we just put these numbers up to show like what 23 acres can produce. And at 5 million market oysters, they're all sold for $3 a piece. I mean, that is $15 million on 23 acres.
Yeah, this kind of farm provides really good like work for people. It could be year round. We love it because we can harvest our oysters every week, and it's a really consistent way to make a living.
And Homer's a really small community, and our product, all the restaurants use it, and all the lodges and water taxis are now all stopping at the farm stand. So it makes us really proud, and all those other businesses are making money on our product. Even the server, waiter or waitress at 15% tip at $3 is making 45-50 cents an oyster, every oyster they serve.
So we calculate that if the farmer can make 50 cents, and then the server, and then the middleman, like it creates a lot of sustainable economic dollars. And it's a really great way for people to enjoy seafood sustainably. We feel that shellfish farming may be one of the best opportunities for communities to simultaneously restore ecosystems and provide nutritious food for current and future populations. There's our son Rockwell eating some seaweed. Because we have all this kelp, he went and started a little seaweed seasoning business where he takes our dried seaweed and mixes it into a seasoning and sells it in Halibut Cove. So there's just an example of how it's benefiting, the younger generation as well as us. We want to thank the Sakonnet Preservation Society for your mission of preserving the rural character and natural resources of Little Compton for the lasting benefit of the community. Little Compton's just such a special place, and we love how agriculture and the rural character is supported there, and always has been. And it was a really important place for us to learn all of our appreciation for nature and the community as well. That it's just such a special place.
Yes.
Does anyone have any questions?
I have a couple to start with. And if anyone wants to put further questions either into the chat, or if you want to use the raise hand, feel free to do so. So you mentioned that with this ecosystem-based approach, there's like this symbiosis, like one thing supports another. Are there animals and organisms that can attach to those that are negatively affecting your ability to harvest a product, and how do you kind of look at that in the context of that ecosystem approach?
Yes, one of the main things with the oyster gear is keeping it fairly clean so the oysters have flow, because we're not feeding them, and the number one thing is the water moving through the oysters, and we have mussel sets and things like that, and you do have to take care of them and clean the gear. But the overall benefits, we kill billions of mussels every year, but still we release billions of mussels too. We're just washing it off. A lot of it gets washed off, and like our neighbor that you saw, Coral there, the Native Alaskan, she just tells everyone how we're seeding the bay. Like we literally go and we hose it off, or we run it through our tumbler, and it's all just getting washed off and then kind of planted in Halibut Cove.
Yeah, and the kelp is pretty thick, so it can create quite a bit of drag on our lines. So we do have to pull some of it off. But the same time as Greg was saying, it washing off, then that kelp floats away. And in where we're located, it's critical habitat area because this is a national marine estuarine reserve, and they even protect the kelp. They consider the kelp that's floating around as critical habitat, and it's used, even if we don't use it, by, you know, snails and different things will eat it. They even are finding bears eating kelp and needing it. It's really rich in all of the vitamins and minerals that we need. So,
If someone hasn't tried kelp, what does kelp taste like?
the consistency, I'd say, is a little more rubbery than normal food. If you like a seaweed salad is something good to start with, or if you do like nori and sushi, then that's a type of seaweed. So you have a good chance of enjoying it.
And just like using it as a seasoning, it has natural MSG, so it really brings out the flavor and really stimulates the taste buds.
And it can be a substitute for salt as well, a seaweed seasoning.
How do you shape an oyster?
Oysters naturally in the wild all want to stick to each other, and they want to just grow in an oyster reef. And oyster farms, there's all sorts of ways to shape them. We use the tumbler, where it's like that tumbler just goes, it's like a big washing machine, they go through that. That makes them have their cup and gets them to shape properly. A lot of farms in the East Coast use like the floating bags where they're up on the surface and the waves tumble them. And so on the West Coast, they have flip-flop bags where the bag is in the tide zone. And then when the tide comes up, the bag goes up, it has a float on it. So they're just doing this with every tide. So you do have to shape the oysters. And that's one thing that makes all the oysters from different oyster farms different, is the different shapes and sizes. And we on our farm use the tumbling method, running them through the tumbler. And it's a slower growing oyster here. So we can only have to tumble maybe once or twice a year. Whereas if you're doing that technique in Rhode Island, you know, you grow your oysters in 18 to 24 months. And it would be, you know, you'd have to tumble them 3 or 4 times a year. And when you were talking about those trays, like 90,000 trays, that's a lot to tumble in a year, a couple times. So you really have to work on mechanization, and we talked about the farmer and the farm operations. It's really like strategizing and making it more efficient. Mechanization.
I imagine if you're expanding, that you need to, you know, plan, okay, at what point do we need to add a second machine to tumble? And there's like interlocking pieces that you sort of have to take in mind.
That's really what our business is right now. It's just like getting all the pieces in place. People are like, why don't you just have your operation fully in swing? You know, why isn't it all developed? It's like, it's so hard to get all those pieces in place and to do it economically. And
because it takes 3 to 4 years, you have all those crops in the water during that time. I can see Mike Letterman has his hand up.
Yes, I just asked him to unmute so he could ask his question.
Okay.
Hi, Weatherly. Hi, Greg. This is a great presentation. I've really learned a lot, and you've made me hungry. So my question is, are your oysters ever going to make it to the East Coast, you think, and specifically anywhere around Little Compton?
yes, we definitely ship back to the East Coast. We ship to Boston every week, twice a week, a lot of times. So they're in Boston, they're on the East Coast.
We'll try to find out which restaurants.
We can ask them where in Rhode Island, our distributor in Boston.
Well, that'd be fantastic. It really would be. One of my fondest memories continues to be popping oysters on your raft with the Swiss Army blade and just slurping them down. They're the best.
That's the best way to have them on the farm.
Yeah. All right.
And Rhode Island has quite a few oyster farms. We went to the University of Rhode Island, they have one of the best aquaculture programs in the United States. And because Rhode Island's so small, they really put a lot into their aquaculture program early on. I think they knew they might not have the developable acreage, but that it's such an important part of who we are to grow shellfish and fish and sustainably do that for growing populations. And so I'm not sure, there's one oyster farm in Little Compton, Peters, forgive me for not knowing the name off the top of my head, Sakonnet oysters, or but that's great to support your local oyster farmers too, and find out. And even a tour on an oyster farm over in Matunic, there's an oyster farm that has an oyster restaurant and might offer farm tours. So it's just cool to see how oysters are grown and how they're benefiting the water and different communities.
I think I see another question. How many folks do you employ in your farming operation during the year? Is it seasonal or is it all year round, quite stable?
It's definitely year round for us. We harvest year round, 52 weeks out of the year. And the employees kind of come and go. We're in a labor shortage right now. For the summer, we're looking to hire at least 4. And like a lot of places, we're in a really big housing crunch in Homer. It's become so popular with the tourists that it's really hard for workers to find housing. So we're kind of like dealing with that after the pandemic. And I mean, a minimum of 4 employees, then us 2, and our son Rockwell works pretty much, he says he's going to work full time this summer. So if there was 7 of us out there every day, that would we might be able to keep up with it. And we could probably use 10 total.
Yeah. How do you cope with the cold in the winter?
You know, you gotta get used to it. You saw the oyster processing barge there with our lobster boat tied up to it. We were in that all day today, and it's snowing. We got almost a foot of snow so far today, and it's blowing 30, 35. And so we were in the little building. It's got heat. We've got the garage doors shut, and you kind of get used to it.
Yeah, Rhode Island's a little bit more favorable climate, I think. But yeah, I guess we just got used to it.
The Pacific oyster, the oyster that we grow out here, it grows much better in colder waters. We wouldn't be able to grow the eastern oyster out here. It's too cold. But the Pacific oyster does okay. And oysters are the most like cultured crop in mariculture. They're really popular. There's thousands and thousands of oyster farms in the US, from mom and pop operations that just operate for a couple of weekends a year, to in Washington where they have 500-600 employees out there on the farms and are farming tens of thousands of acres. The West Coast industry is much bigger and much more industrialized. Farms that are produce 40, 50 million oysters with the same techniques that we do.
Yeah, like a lot of the coastline of Washington state is oyster farms. So they're, yeah, by far the largest oyster farms in the country. They have a lot of estuaries there, and the oyster industry is well over 100 years, and it's really accepted and like a cultural part of the culture there, farming of oysters. And like when we first started our farm, it was a little like tense between us and a few of the fishermen, and the landowners weren't quite sure, like, what are we going to be out there all the time working? Like, is it going to be a huge disturbance? And people, once we started, you know, working the farm and providing the community with shellfish that they could eat, and they realized, like, we don't work on Memorial Day weekend and we're not out there really early in the morning. We try to be courteous, and now it's like super accepted, and the fishermen get oysters from us and they realize like this is really benefiting us to have an oyster farm. And even though visually they look at us, but I think our neighbors enjoy watching us work, and it like gives the community kind of more excitement having a business out in front, and it draws a lot of attention to the community. As Greg was saying, like oyster tourism is getting really popular in Maine. They started the Maine Oyster Trail, and you can go from farm to farm trying oysters. Oysters are really special because they really are like a gift from the ocean, from the local water. They take on like the flavor, the terroir of the ocean, which is specific to where they are grown. So an oyster in our bay can taste completely different from one that's just, 5 or 6 miles away. So every oyster farmer, we're all like really proud of our product, and I think they all have really special qualities.
And back to the community, the oyster farms have been here for 30 years. We arrived about 15 years ago. And for 15, 20 years, oyster farms were out there not really producing much. And the community was a lot of the community members were actually writing letters to the state opposing them and saying that they weren't good, they should take them away. And then we came along and started producing and making something of it, and kind of like turning the farms around, buying them up and turning them into something profitable. And they see the family out there, and those same people that were writing letters of opposition are now writing letters of support. And they're like, oh, this is great. And communities from all over the state are actually contacting us and being like, we need this in our community.
Yeah, like it gives people a real opportunity to connect with the land, seeing how oysters are grown. We get lots of kayaks and, small boats coming through our farm. And, people love to be able to get their food right out of the ocean. They can just go grab some oysters from us, and it's like the freshest seafood you can have.
And our farm is giving back so much more than we're taking. In the fact that like we're not a commercial fishery where we're just like taking the fish. We're taking some algae but we're producing so much more with it, with all the little creatures that have habitat and places to live and stuff, all that biodiversity.
Yeah.
Okay, I have 2 more questions. Obviously, Rhode Island and Little Compton specifically being this little peninsula, we have so much coast, and we have one oyster farm in Little Compton. And having gone to URI, what do you see as the limitations of oyster farming growing here? Like what's kind of stopping it from taking hold?
I think regulation, and it needs more community support to get these farms in place. Like, to start an oyster farm is a lot of work, and it is farming, and it's super hard work, and it takes 3 to 4 years. And I think if you're facing any kind of opposition, that is such a big hurdle to build your farm at all. And it is like the Atlantic Ocean is, it gets pretty rough, and you need to have your oyster farm in a sheltered area. Where we are is in a bay. So it really takes like a sheltered area where there might be more user conflicts. And I think it's those user conflicts that are kind of like a stumbling block for siting your operation. You got to have like the favorable community. It's almost like if Little Compton came together as a community and figured out where the best sites were, because you need access to the ocean, the farmer does, and there's not that many public points of entrance for people. Like you know, you need a place to store some gear, so you have to own property or work with a landowner to store your gear. So I think it takes like a lot of community support. I know the markets are there and the environment is there. Like Little Compton used to produce so many oysters, and people are living on oysters for thousands of years, and seafood and shellfish. So I'd say the environment's really good, but just finding a place where it fits in with the community.
And the community support is huge. If we had just moved to a remote spot in Alaska and gotten 23 acres and tried to farm, like, we definitely wouldn't have made it. Like, it was the community support that made us successful. Like, people supporting us, everything from watching the kids and like helping us raise our kids to technical knowledge to sort of providing us with equipment and this and that. So like, it was really like the community support that made us successful.
Do you see a connection between your farming operation and, you know, other mariculture operations and the surrounding area? So like, you know, the mountains, the rivers, the forest, the, you know, upstream fish, that sort of thing?
Definitely think the ocean and the land are very connected. Like the nutrients we get from that make the algae grow are from the land. Like big rainfall events cause like algae blooms to happen, and algae blooms can be bad if there's like too much nutrients, but for the most part, at least where we are and there's no humans, it's in balance. So they're really good for our shellfish. And yeah, the marine creatures, they like algae starts blooming when there's wind events and erosion from the rocks that puts different minerals into the water that triggers the algae to bloom. And also the ocean is feeding the forest because all the moisture that that comes as rainfall comes from the ocean originally. It's evaporated. And so anyway, yeah, we definitely see a lot of ocean forest connections, especially in Alaska, where we still have natural salmon runs. The salmon, they go in upstream and then die, and their carcasses feed the forest. So it is really apparent up here how much the oceans and the land is connected. And it's like that in Little Compton too. We might have lost a little bit of that connection from early damming of rivers and hindrances, but the fish migrate up into fresh water, like in Quicksand Pond. They're coming back strong. And so it is like that connection's there. So it's always important to remember what kind of water pollutants you're putting just in your own yard, like fertilizing or chemicals, because all of that ends up in the ocean eventually. And we all have one ocean. Our oceans are all connected. So the less pollutants we can put onto our soils and into our earth, the better for our oceans.
It always amazes me that Narragansett Bay had the most densely populated Native Americans back in the 1400s. Back when, the first white people were arriving, that was the most densely populated Native Americans in North America, and it was because of the shellfish.
Yeah, there are theories that shellfish actually fueled like human development and expansion, that we weren't living off woolly mammoths, but we traveled the Bering Land Bridge down the coast and we subsisted on shellfish. And shellfish is like a huge brain food, so it like helped us evolve to be smart. And shellfish is just really good for you.
And people have been in Halibut Cove for 5, 6, 7,000 years. So it just shows to us like, oh, this is a good spot to grow shellfish because the middens are loaded with shells and the people have been here for thousands of years.
My last question that I have is 100 years ago, they collected and sold kelp in Rhode Island, and now no one seems to. Is that something you could farm locally? And if so, could you do it Like the way that you do it with the shellfish is sort of like symbiotic. Could you do it independently? Would it be worthwhile, I guess?
Yeah, people are trying to develop kelp farms on the East Coast, Rhode Island, New York, Maine is getting really big into kelp. So I do think you can grow kelp as a standalone crop. To us, it benefits our shellfish. I think the more you can integrate them, the better, because it would take less gear overall, like if you can put it all in the same system.
But the shellfish is worth so much more, and the coastline in Little Compton is pretty limited. So, you know, developing shellfish farms, like your farm gate value would be so much more with shellfish. The kelp does need a lot more area. I mean, you definitely could grow kelp, but it's worth so much less. So if you like, you know, you set up a couple of farms at 5 acres, with shellfish at 5 acres, you could support a family. With kelp, you wouldn't, you know, it wouldn't be worth enough to support a family at 5 acres.
I think that's probably our last question for the evening. I'm conscious that we're keeping you, and I want to thank you for your talk this evening. It's been fascinating. If anybody has any further questions, then you could just email them to us at SPA and we'll pass them on. We did put the link to the extra tough video in the chat section, which we can send to people if they want to have a look at that as well. Again, Greg and Weatherly, this has been amazing. Thank you very much for your time. I know it's not easy organizing your lives around, you know, such a large time difference and everything. So thank you. And I'd also like to remind everybody that next month, April the 21st, we're showing the movie Microcosmos at the Little Compton Community Center at 7 p.m. And it is a family-friendly movie, so all the kids can come along to that one, although 7 p.m. might put a few people off. So I think that's it. Abigail, would you like to say any final words before we go? No, I don't think so. She's, hang on.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to say, again, sort of repeat some of what Joy said, and thanking you, Weatherly and Greg, for doing this for us. It's just really extraordinary. And it's quite moving to listen to what you're doing, and inspiring, really, to think about what you're doing and the example that you're setting of this, how do I want to say it, sort of environmentally sensitive and productive, life producing and enlarging and engaging experience, and raising your children in it and really influencing your community. It's just extremely powerful example. Thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much. It was so awesome to see everyone, and makes me want to get back there.